The heat of the mid-morning sun hammered down on the dusty thoroughfare of Black Ridge, creating shimmering mirages that distorted the horizon and made the distant mesas look like they were melting into the earth. Maylin sat rigid on the buckboard seat of the weathered wagon, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide the tremors that threatened to betray her terror. She wore a dress of plain blue cotton, a stark departure from the silk she had known in her former life. But it was not the fabric that chafed her skin. It was the weight of the stares that bore into her from every porch and window. She had traveled across an ocean, and then halfway across a savage continent, sold on a promise of stability that now looked like nothing more than a cruel joke. Beside her sat the man she was now bound to, a man named Cole. He was a silent, monolithic figure, his hat pulled low over eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. His clothes were worn, stained with the red dust of the territory, and the wagon they rode in creaked with the pathetic groan of rotting wood. To anyone watching, and indeed to Maylin herself, he looked like a destitute drifter, a man scraping the bottom of the barrel in a land that devoured the weak. As the wagon rattled past the saloon, the distinct sound of laughter erupted from the shadows of the overhang. A group of men, leaning idly against the railing, pointed openly at the mismatched pair. Maylin kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her fear, but she saw Cole's jaw tighten, a subtle ripple of muscle that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge the jeers. He simply flicked the reins, his hands rough and scarred, guiding the tired horses with a strange, gentle precision that contradicted his rugged appearance. "Keep your eyes up," Cole murmured, his voice a low gravel that barely rose above the sound of the wheels grinding against the dirt. "They smell fear like blood in the water. Don't give it to them." It was the most he had spoken in 3 hours. Maylin glanced at him, searching for some sign of reassurance, but his profile was carved from stone, indifferent to the humiliation of their arrival. She felt a cold pit of despair open in her stomach. She had expected a hard life, yes, but she had expected a husband with a farm, perhaps a modest plot of land where corn or wheat struggled toward the sun. Instead, she was attached to a man who seemed to own nothing but the dust on his boots and a wagon that threatened to collapse with every revolution of its wheels. The town behind them faded into a haze of heat, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, clung to her skin like the grit of the road. The journey out of town took them through a landscape that was both majestic and desolate, a sprawling expanse of scrub brush and jagged rock formations that seemed to stretch into eternity. The spring wildflowers were blooming, bursting with violent purples and yellows against the red earth, but Maylin could find no beauty in them, only the vast emptiness of her future. They traveled for hours, the sun climbing to its zenith and then beginning its slow descent, casting long, bruised shadows across the trail. Cole remained silent, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines, his posture relaxed yet alert, like a predator feigning sleep. It was late afternoon when he finally slowed the horses, turning the wagon off the main trail onto a barely visible path that wound its way up a steep, rocky incline. The wagon lurched violently, and Maylin had to grab the bench to steady herself, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice thin in the dry air. "Home," Cole replied, the word landing with a heaviness she couldn't interpret. They crested the ridge and the property came into view. Maylin's breath hitched, but not from awe. It was a ruin. A small, leaning shack sat isolated in a patch of dry dirt, surrounded by a broken fence that wouldn't have kept out a stray dog, let alone a wolf. The roof was patched with mismatched timber, and the windows were dark, gaping holes that stared back at her like the eyes of a skull. This was it. This was the life she had been sold into. A sob caught in her throat, sharp and painful, but she swallowed it down. She was a survivor. She had survived the crossing, the auction block, and the journey west. She would survive this desolate patch of dirt, too. Cole brought the wagon to a halt in front of the shack and set the brake. He didn't look at her, didn't offer an apology for the squalor. He simply hopped down, his boots kicking up a cloud of dust, and began unhitching the horses. Maylin climbed down slowly, her legs stiff, and looked around the perimeter. It was quiet, disturbingly so. But as she watched Cole work, she noticed something that didn't fit the narrative of the poor, broken farmer. He moved with an efficiency that was almost military. He checked the cinches, checked the hooves, and then, with a casual motion that was too smooth to be accidental, he adjusted the heavy revolver on his hip. It was a pristine weapon, the metal gleaming and well-oiled, a stark contrast to the poverty of the shack. It was the first breadcrumb of a mystery she was too exhausted to solve. The interior of the shack was as bleak as the exterior promised. A single room, dusty and stiflingly hot, with a cast-iron stove in the corner and a narrow cot pushed against the wall. The air smelled of stale smoke and neglect. Maylin stood in the center of the room, her small travel bag clutched in her hand, feeling the walls closing in on her. Cole entered behind her, carrying a crate of supplies. He set it down on the warped table without a word. "It's not much," he said, and for the first time she detected a note of something else in his voice. Not shame exactly, but a guarded, almost testing quality. "It's a roof," she replied, her voice steady, refusing to let him see her disappointment. She set her bag down and immediately began to survey the room for what could be done. She would not weep. She would work. Cole watched her for a moment, his dark eyes tracking her movements as she rolled up her sleeves. He seemed to be measuring her, calculating her resilience against some invisible standard. "There's water in the barrel out back," he said, turning toward the door. "I have to check the perimeter before dark." Maylin paused. Perimeter? The word felt too tactical for a man living in a shack in the middle of nowhere. "Coyotes," he said shortly, but the way his hand hovered near his holster suggested he was worried about two-legged predators, not four. He stepped out into the dying light, leaving her alone in the gloom. As she began to sweep the floor with a makeshift broom she found in the corner, her mind raced. The poverty was real enough, the dirt, the lack of furniture, the meager food supplies, but the man didn't fit the setting. He didn't walk like a beaten man. He walked like a man who owned the ground beneath his feet, even if that ground appeared to be worthless. She found a loose floorboard near the stove and pried it up, hoping to find a cellar or some storage, but found only packed earth. However, in the dirt, something glinted. She reached down and pulled out a shell casing. It wasn't old and rusted. It was fresh brass. She turned it over in her fingers, the metal cool against her skin. Why would a poor farmer need to expend expensive ammunition in his own home? The sound of Cole's boots on the porch made her shove the casing into her pocket, her heart racing with a sudden, undefined suspicion. 2 days later, the reality of their situation became violently clear during a necessary trip back to Black Ridge for supplies. The initial silence of the town had curdled into active hostility. As Cole tied the horses to the rail outside the general store, a group of riders drifted down the main street, their horses kicking up lazy clouds of dust. At the center was a man who radiated the kind of power that comes from unchecked wealth and cruelty. Harrigan. He wore a suit that cost more than Cole's entire wagon, and his smile was a slash of white in a tanned, leathery face. He pulled his horse up alongside them, blocking their path to the store entrance. Maylin instinctively stepped closer to Cole, feeling the sudden drop in temperature despite the midday sun. "Well now," Harrigan drawled, his voice carrying clearly to the gathered onlookers, "if it isn't the squatter and his new purchase. I heard you went and got yourself a bride, Cole. Didn't think you had 2 nickels to rub together." The men around Harrigan chuckled, a low, menacing sound. Cole didn't flinch. He continued to adjust the strap on the saddlebag, his back to Harrigan, a display of disrespect so profound it sucked the air out of the street. "We're just here for flour and nails, Harrigan," Cole said, his voice flat and bored. "Let us pass." Harrigan's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of genuine anger. He leaned down from his saddle, his shadow falling over Maylin. "You're sitting on my land, boy. That scrap of dirt you're clinging to? It's going to be mine, one way or another." He looked at Maylin, his eyes raking over her with disgusting familiarity. "Shame to see a pretty thing like this starve to death out there when I burn you out." Cole turned then. The movement was slow, deliberate. He looked up at Harrigan, and for a second the mask slipped. The poor farmer vanished, and something lethal looked out from Cole's eyes. It was a look of such intense, concentrated violence that Harrigan's horse shied away, sensing the threat, even if its rider was too arrogant to see it fully. "You can try," Cole said softly, "but bring more men." The tension in the air was brittle, ready to snap. Harrigan's hand twitched toward his gun, but he hesitated. There was something in Cole's stillness, a coiled readiness that whispered of a trap. With a sneer, Harrigan wheeled his horse around. "Enjoy the honeymoon," he spat. "It'll be short." As the riders clattered away, Maylin released a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hands were shaking. She looked at Cole, expecting to see fear, or at least adrenaline. Instead, he was checking a list in his hand as if he had just discussed the weather. "Come on," he said, ushering her into the store. "We need to be back before sunset." Inside the cool, dim interior of the store, surrounded by the smell of coffee beans and leather, Maylin confronted him. "Who is he?" she whispered urgently, glancing at the shopkeeper who was pretending not to listen. "A man who thinks he's a king because he has a big fence," Cole muttered, picking up a sack of flour. "He wants the land? Why?" she pressed. "It's just rocks and dust." Cole paused, his hand resting on the counter. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of respect in his eyes. "Because he thinks that's all it is," he said cryptically, "and as long as he thinks that, we have the advantage." The ride back to the shack was grueling, the atmosphere heavy with the threat Harrigan had left hanging in the air. The sun was setting by the time they reached the property line, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the trail, turning every bush and rock into a potential ambush. Maylin sat stiffly, her eyes darting to every movement in the brush. Cole was pushing the horses harder now, the wagon bouncing roughly over the uneven terrain. He wasn't relaxed anymore. His eyes were constantly checking the rear, scanning the ridge, watching the sky. The sense of urgency was palpable. They weren't just going home. They were running for cover. When they finally pulled up to the shack, the darkness was nearly complete. "Get inside," Cole ordered, his voice sharp. "Don't light the lantern yet." Maylin scrambled down and rushed into the shack, the darkness inside feeling less like a shelter and more like a cage. She heard Cole securing the horses, moving with rapid, heavy steps. He entered a moment later, barring the door with a heavy beam she hadn't noticed before. He moved to the window, peering out through the cracks in the shutters, his revolver drawn. "Are they coming tonight?" Maylin asked, her voice trembling. "They're always coming," Cole replied, not looking away from the window. "Harrigan doesn't like to wait." He turned to her then, the moonlight slicing through the slats and illuminating half his face. "I need you to trust me," he said. Things aren't what they look like here. But I can't explain it all yet. Not until I know you can handle it." "Handle what?" she demanded, frustration overriding her fear. "Living in a ruin? Being threatened by tyrants? I handled leaving my home, Cole. I handled the ship. I think I can handle the truth." Cole studied her, silence stretching between them. Then he holstered his gun. He walked over to the corner of the room to a heavy wooden chest that looked like the only solid piece of furniture in the place. He pulled a key from a chain around his neck, a complex, heavy iron key that looked far too sophisticated for a simple lock. He didn't open the chest, though. Instead, he handed the key to her. "Keep this on you," he said. "If anything happens to me, if they come and I'm not here, you take the horse and you ride to the canyon north of here. Use this on the gate." Maylin stared at the key. It was heavy, cold, and intricate. "What gate?" she asked. "There's nothing north but cliffs." Cole's expression hardened. "Just promise me." She nodded slowly, her fingers closing around the cold metal. The wind howled outside, rattling the loose boards of the shack, sounding like a chorus of ghosts trying to get in. The attack came 3 nights later, not with a roar, but with the smell of smoke. Maylin woke to Cole's hand over her mouth, his eyes wide and urgent in the dark. "Get up," he hissed. "They're torching the brush." The orange glow was already flickering through the cracks in the walls. Panic surged through her, but Cole was already moving. He wasn't panicking, he was operating. He grabbed a rifle from beneath the cot and kicked open the back door, dragging her out into the cool night air. The front of the property was ablaze, a wall of fire racing toward the shack, fueled by the dry spring wind. Silhouettes of men on horseback were visible against the flames, whooping and firing shots into the air. Harrigan's men. "They want to flush us out," Cole said, his voice calm and terrifying. "They think we'll run to the open road." "Where do we go?" Maylin coughed, the smoke stinging her eyes. Cole grabbed her arm and pulled her not toward the road, but toward the rocky cliff face behind the shack, the direction that seemed to offer no escape. "We don't run," he said. "We advance." He led her into a narrow fissure in the rock she had never noticed, a hidden trail that cut sharply upward into the darkness. They scrambled up the loose scree, the sounds of the fire and the shouting men fading slightly below them. From this vantage point, she looked down and saw the shack, her only home, catch fire. The flames licked up the dry wood, consuming it in seconds. "It's gone," she whispered, horror gripping her chest. "Everything is gone." Cole stopped climbing. He stood on a ledge overlooking the burning ruin, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. He didn't look defeated. He looked vindicated. "That wasn't home, Maylin," he said, his voice strong over the roar of the fire. "That was just the camouflage." He turned and pointed up the trail, where the moonlight illuminated a narrow pass that opened up into something vast beyond the ridge. "It's time you saw the real reason Harrigan wants me dead." He took her hand, his grip firm and warm. "Come on." They crested the final rise, and the world opened up. Maylin gasped, her knees nearly buckling. Below them, nestled in a hidden hanging valley that was invisible from the desert floor, lay a sprawling, verdant paradise. It wasn't just a farm, it was a fortress. Silver streams of water, diverted from the high peaks, fed acres of lush green pasture where hundreds of cattle grazed, sleek, healthy beasts that were worth a fortune. In the center of the valley sat a massive main house built of stone and timber, glowing with the warm light of lanterns in every window. Outbuildings, barns, and bunkhouses surrounded it, an entire self-sustaining settlement protected by the natural fortress of the canyon walls. It was an empire hidden in the sky, a secret kingdom of water and wealth in a land of dust. You own this?" she stammered, unable to comprehend the scale of the deception. Cole looked down at the burning shack in the distance, then back at the sanctuary he had built. "My father found the water," he said quietly. "I built the walls. Harrigan suspects there's water up here, but he has no idea what we really have. He thinks he's fighting a beggar." Cole turned to her, his face illuminated by the moon and the distant fire, the poor farmer mask gone forever. "He's about to find out he's at war with a king. And you," he said, nodding to the valley, "are the lady of the house. Welcome home, Maylin." The descent into the hidden valley was a journey through a veil between worlds, leaving behind the scorched, hostile desert for an oasis that smelled of damp earth, sage, and blooming clover. As the horses navigated the switchbacks, the cool air rising from the valley floor brushed against Mei Lin's face, washing away the heat of the fire that had consumed their decoy life. They rode past herds of cattle that watched them with lazy indifference, their coats sleek and heavy with fat, livestock that represented a fortune in a territory starving for beef. But it was the house that held Mei Lin's gaze. As they approached, the scale of it became undeniable. It was a fortress of hewn timber and native stone, built to endure centuries, with wide porches wrapping around the lower level, and chimneys puffing gentle, welcoming smoke into the starlit sky. Men appeared from the shadows of the barns, not the jagged, desperate drifters of the town, but clean-shaven, well-armed men who nodded to Cole with the easy respect of soldiers greeting a commander. They took the horses without a word, their eyes flickering briefly to Mei Lin with curiosity, but no malice. Cole guided her up the stone steps to the heavy oak double doors, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back. The heat of the fire was still a phantom sensation on her skin, but here, in the shadow of the mountain, safety felt like a physical weight settling over her shoulders. Inside, the house was a revelation of comfort and hidden power. The floors were polished hardwood covered in thick, woven rugs that muffled their footsteps, and the walls were lined with books and maps rather than bare timber. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth, casting a golden glow over leather armchairs and a mahogany dining table set with silver that gleamed in the firelight. Cole closed the door behind them, the heavy thud shutting out the rest of the world. He turned to her, removing his hat and tossing it onto a side table, his face finally relaxing from the mask of the stoic peasant. "I'm sorry for the deception," he said, his voice low and echoing in the large room. He walked to a basin of water near the entrance, dipped a cloth, and wrung it out. He approached her slowly, the gesture intimate and unguarded. "But out there, wealth is a target. I needed to know who you were before I brought you inside the walls." He gently wiped a smudge of soot from her cheek, his knuckles grazing her skin. Mei Lin stood frozen, her heart hammering not from fear, but from the sudden proximity of this stranger who was her husband. "And who am I?" she whispered, looking up into his dark eyes. Cole paused, his hand lingering on her face. "You're the woman who didn't run," he said softly. "You stood in the dirt and fought for a ruin. That makes you worthy of the kingdom." The next morning broke with a serenity that felt almost suspicious after the chaos of the night before. Mei Lin woke in a bed buried under down quilts, sunlight streaming through glass windows, real glass, not oiled paper, illuminating a room that smelled of lavender and cedar. She found clothes laid out for her, riding leathers, a linen shirt, and sturdy boots, practical gear that spoke of action rather than ornamentation. When she descended the stairs, she found Cole in what looked like a war room. A massive map of the territory was spread across a table, weighted down by ammunition boxes and a compass. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment the strategist vanished, replaced by a man simply admiring his wife. "Coffee," he said, pushing a steaming porcelain cup toward her. "Black, strong. We have work to do." Mei Lin took the cup, walking to the table to study the map. She traced the lines of the canyon, seeing the choke points and the water sources marked in red ink. "Harrigan controls the town," she observed, her finger resting on the cluster of buildings called Black Ridge. "But you control the water." "He controls the road," Cole corrected, moving to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing hers. "He squeezes the supply lines. He thinks he can starve the valley out by blocking the trade routes. That's why I posed as a poor farmer, to slip into town, gather intelligence, and move supplies without drawing his main force." He pointed to the spot where their shack had burned. "He thinks he won last night. He thinks he burned out a squatter. By noon, his scouts will find the tracks leading into the rocks. By sundown, He'll realize the squatter has vanished into thin air, and he'll come looking. The tension in the room spiked, but it was a shared tension now, a partnership forged in the anticipation of violence. Maylin looked at the map, her mind working sharply. "If he comes up the trail we used," she said, tracing the narrow switchbacks, "he'll be in a single file, exposed." Cole nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face, a genuine smile that softened the hard lines of his jaw. "Exactly. It's a kill box." He turned to her, his expression intensifying. "I have men to hold the line, Maylin, but I need someone watching the back gate, the pass to the north." He reached out, taking her hand and pressing a heavy brass spyglass into her palm. "I trust no one else with my blind spot." The preparation for the assault was a blur of controlled chaos. The ranch hands transformed into a disciplined militia, positioning rifles behind rock walls and checking sight lines. Cole moved among them, issuing orders with quiet authority, but his eyes constantly returned to Maylin. She had ridden to the northern ridge, a high vantage point that offered a view of the treacherous goat path winding down the back of the mountain. It was silent up there, the wind whipping her hair across her face, but she felt a strange calm. She was no longer the terrifyingly vulnerable bride on a rickety wagon. She was the sentinel of the valley. Through the spyglass, she scanned the horizon, her thoughts drifting to the man below. The romance between them wasn't built on poetry or courtly gestures. It was being built on this terrified, exhilarating trust. When she rode back down at midday to report, Cole met her at the stable. He lifted her down from the saddle, his hands gripping her waist firmly. "Clear?" he asked. "Clear," she replied. "But the wind is shifting. Dust rising in the east." Cole pulled her closer, the adrenaline of the looming fight acting as a catalyst. He kissed her then, hard and desperate, a claiming that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with shared survival. "Stay close to the house when it starts," he murmured against her hair. "I can't fight him if I'm looking for you." The attack didn't come as a stealthy raid. It came as a siege. Just as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, the crack of a rifle echoed off the canyon walls, shattering the peace of the valley. Harrigan had brought an army. From the veranda, Maylin watched as puffs of smoke bloomed on the distant ridge. Cole was out there, a silhouette on the ramparts, his rifle speaking in rhythmic, thumping retorts. The valley, designed as a trap, was working perfectly. Harrigan's men were bottled up in the narrow pass, unable to advance against the withering fire from Cole's entrenched positions. But panic flared in Maylin's chest when she saw a second column of dust, not from the east, but from the north. The back gate. Her sector. Harrigan wasn't just a brute. He was a tactician. He had sent a flanking force to scale the cliffs. She didn't run to the house. She ran to the warning bell mounted near the kitchen, a massive iron triangle used to call the hands to dinner. She grabbed the striker and hammered it with all her strength, 3 sharp, dissonant clangs that cut through the noise of the gunfire. Cole heard the signal. He spun around, seeing Maylin pointing frantically toward the northern ridge. He didn't hesitate. Signaling his lieutenant to hold the main gate, he sprinted toward the horses, vaulting into the saddle of his black stallion. He rode not away from the fight, but across the open pasture toward the northern breach, yelling for Maylin to get inside. But she didn't. She grabbed the repeater rifle Cole had left on the porch, a weapon he had shown her how to load just hours before, and leveled it on the porch railing. As the first of Harrigan's flankers crested the northern ridge, expecting an undefended rear, they were met not with silence, but with the sharp crack of Maylin's defiance. Her shot went wide, kicking up dirt, but it stalled them just long enough. It bought the seconds Cole needed. He thundered up the slope, firing from the saddle, a demon of dust and fury. The flankers, caught between a woman who refused to yield and a man who rode like the apocalypse, broke. They scrambled back down the scree, their surprise attack dissolving into a rout. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the gunfire. The sun had set, leaving the valley bathed in a bruised purple twilight. Harrigan's forces, broken on the rocks of the main pass and repelled at the flank, had retreated, leaving their wounded and their pride in the dust. Cole rode back to the main house, his horse frothed with sweat, his shirt stained with dirt and gunpowder. He slid from the saddle and walked up the steps, his chest heaving. Maylin was still standing by the railing, the rifle clutched in her white-knuckled hands. She was trembling now, the adrenaline crash hitting her all at once. Cole didn't say a word. He walked straight to her, took the rifle gently from her hands, and set it against the wall. Then he swept her into his arms, burying his face in the crook of her neck. They stood there for a long time, the smell of cordite and sweat mingling with the night-blooming jasmine. "You held the line," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us." Maylin pulled back to look at him, seeing the exhaustion and the adoration in his eyes. "We saved us," she corrected. The next day, the dynamic of the territory had shifted irrevocably. Cole and Maylin rode into Black Ridge, not in a rotting wagon, but on thoroughbred horses, flanked by 6 armed outriders. The town was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of awe and fear. Harrigan stood on the porch of the marshal's office, nursing a bandaged arm, his face a mask of bitter defeat. He watched them pass, his power broken by the realization that he had picked a fight with a force he couldn't comprehend. Cole stopped his horse in the center of the street, right where they had been humiliated days before. He looked at Harrigan, then at the townspeople peering from the windows. "The valley is closed," Cole announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "Anyone who wants honest work can come to the gate. Anyone who brings war will be buried at it." He looked at Maylin, and the fierce protectiveness in his eyes softened into something profound and public. He reached out and took her hand, interlacing their fingers for all to see. It was the final seal on their victory, a declaration that the poor farmer and the immigrant bride were the true power of the frontier. As they turned their horses back toward the mountains, toward their home, Maylin squeezed his hand. She had come west expecting to survive a master. She had ended up ruling with a partner. The dust swirled behind them, no longer a shroud of poverty, but the golden haze of a legacy just beginning.